No one grows up dreaming of becoming a mycologist. However, ever since I saw the first Planet Earth movie in college, I have had a deep love and curiosity for fungi, whether it be for cooking, recreational uses, or just studying the way that fungi operate. These organisms are deeply complex and rather overlooked for more glamorous taxons, such as mammals or reptiles. However, these organisms are deeply compelling. One such example is the world's largest organism, which is a 3.4-mile-long fungi that resides in the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. When I got word that the area that this fungi inhabits had opened up due to a sinkhole, I boarded the first flight to Boise to meet up with several of my colleagues to study this creature up close. Prof. Gene Wilson met me at my flight's gate holding up a sign with my name on it and wearing a blue and pink Hawaiian shirt. Gene and I had met back at a college party during my freshman year at Boston University when he had punched a man who got a little too handsy with me. Ever since that day, he has been like a brother to me. As soon as he saw me, he quickly walked up to me and gave me a hug. "Kim, it has been far too long," he exclaimed as he let go of me. "It has," I said as I patted him on the shoulder. "We both chose the wrong professions for keeping close contact." "Definitely," Gene said with a hearty laugh. "You ready to see some fun guys?" I rolled my eyes at his horrible dad joke as he picked up my luggage and we both made our way to his car. "So what do you know about the site? Will it be safe to walk around, or will the park rangers give us trouble for being there?" I asked. "Quite the contrary," Gene said as he struggled with holding my duffel bag. "We've gotten full authorization to go into the sinkhole." As soon as I heard this, I stopped walking and stared at Gene with a confused and clearly excited expression. "Don't fuck with me like that, Gene. Surely you can't be serious," I said as I tugged on his arm. Gene patted my hand and gave me a big smile. "I'm as serious as a heart attack, Kim," got express approval from the CDC to study Mr. Humongous himself. "Oh my god, Gene," I said as I gave him another hug. "This is gonna be the best day of my life." "It's gonna be a day, that's for sure," Gene said as he unlocked his GMC Yukon. "Dr. Alicia Johnson will be meeting us there as well." As we got into his car, Gene turned to look at me. "Kim, National Geographic is going to publish a story about us." "Gene, you better stop giving me good news or I might ugly cry all over your leather seat," I said as I wiped my eyes. Gene laughed as the ignition came to life, and we began our 4-hour road trip to Oregon. "So, what has Kim been up to for the last couple years?" Gene asked endearingly. "Well, I recently accepted a job offer from Boston University," I replied as I looked out the window. "That's incredible, though truthfully, I never saw you as the teaching type," Gene replied. "Ouch, that's cold, Gene," I said sarcastically. "Oh, stop it. You know I don't mean that in a bad way," Gene said as he quickly looked over at me. "You've just always been about working in the field, not in a classroom." "Fair enough," I said as I unfolded my arms. "I guess I just decided that it's time for me to settle down. Plus having 6 months of paid sabbatical is always good. How have you been doing?" "I've been really good," Gene said as a wide smile started to form. "Eric and I actually decided to begin the adoption process." "Oh my god, you're gonna be a dad," I yelled enthusiastically. "Gene, you and Eric are going to be wonderful parents." "Thank you, Kim. That means a lot," Gene said as he let out a heavy sigh. "It's been so stressful lately having to meet with lawyers and child-proofing our home. That's why this trip means so much to me." For the rest of the trip, Gene and I continued to talk about our plans for the future, our work, and reliving our college days. Finally, around 11 a.m., we saw the sign for Malheur National Forest. As we got closer to the research site, a wave of anxiety and excitement washed over the car. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew what the other was thinking. We were about to make history. When we pulled up to the site, we saw that there were 2 cars parked to the side and a young man leaning against a nearby tree. "Wow, look at the fanfare," Gene said sarcastically. "They really rolled out the red carpet this time," I replied, as we both let out a laugh and stepped out of the vehicle. As we grabbed our research kits from the truck, the young man began to walk towards us. "Hi, are you Dr. Wilson and Dr. Bishop?" the young man asked. "That's us," Jean said. "Are you our mighty escort?" "Sure am," the young man said as he grabbed one of the bags on the ground. "I'm Connor Peters. I work under Dr. Johnson." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Connor," I said as I shook his hand. "Let's see the site." After walking for what seemed like a lifetime, we finally made it to a roped-off section of open land. Standing about 20 feet in was Dr. Ashley Johnson and a middle-aged man with a camera around his neck. "Dr. Johnson, we're all here," Connor yelled as we stepped over the rope. "Wonderful," Dr. Johnson said as she and the man made their way towards us. "Dr. Bishop and Dr. Wilson, it's great to see you both again." "The pleasure is all mine," I said as I shook her hand. "Everyone, this is Dan," Dr. Johnson said as she turned to look at Daniel. "He's a reporter from National Geographic." "It's a great honor to be able to venture into this unknown with all of you," Dan said as he snapped a picture of Dr. Wilson and I. "So how far away is this sinkhole?" I asked. "The sinkhole is right over this small hill, but that's not where we will be going doing our research," Dr. Johnson said as she led the group towards the hill. "But isn't that why we planned this excursion?" Jean asked. "It is, but I am more concerned with studying the cave system that the sinkhole managed to unearth," Dr. Johnson said as she began to smile. "A cave system?" I asked. "Yes, a cave system which will allow us to get extraordinarily close to the Armillaria ostoyei fungi," Dr. Johnson said as we neared the top of the hill. "How close?" I asked excitedly. "Practically inside the organism," Connor blurted out. "Dr. Johnson, are you serious?" Jean chimed in. "Take a look for yourself," Dr. Johnson said as she pointed down the hill. From the top of the hill, you could see the massive hole where the ground had given way and begun to expose the vast web of black armillaria roots along the hole's sides. As we got closer to the opening, it was apparent that the hole went down about 100 feet and had a 20-foot radius. "Jesus Christ, this is fucking massive," I said in pure disbelief. Dan had sent his drone down the hole earlier, and the entrance to the cave is about 120 get down, so I hope you're all good at climbing, Dr. Johnson said cheerfully as she began to hand out harnesses. "I haven't climbed anything since middle school, but I guess you're never too old to pick up a new hobby," Gene said as he struggled to put on his harness. "Let's hope then that whoever taught you did a good job," Dan said as he attached the rope to his harness. "I'll go down first." We all watched intently as Dan slowly made the climb down to the bottom of the hole. Once at the bottom, he attached the bottom of the rope to a spike and waved the rest of us down. One by one, Dr. Johnson, Connor, and Jean hooked in their harnesses, grabbed their gear, and began the descent. Once Jean had successfully unhooked himself, it was finally my turn. "Just take it slow and steady," Dan called up to me as I began to descend the rope. As I went down, I noticed that the roots on the walls began to get more prominent until the entire wall had been enveloped in a pulsating black mass. After several minutes of slowly belaying myself down, my feet touched solid ground again. Once I had unclipped from the rope, I turned around to see that the group was staring at something. "Is that the cave?" I said as I walked over to Jean. Jean just nodded in disbelief. Once I reached where they were, I stopped dead in my tracks. In front of us was a 10-foot opening covered in the veiny roots of the fungus. Each root quivered as if to create an optical illusion of waves in the open ocean. Along the floor of the cavern entrance were ancient drawings of symbols that I have never seen before. As we tried to take in the sight of this lost cavern, our fixation was broken by the flashing of Dan's camera. As the flash illuminated the cave, we watched in awe as the pathway ahead seemed to stretch on indefinitely. "Are these ancient ruins?" Connor said as he began to walk towards the cave. "Your guess is as good as mine," Dr. Johnson said as she turned on her flashlight. "Wait, before we go in, we should put on respirators," Gene said as he started looking through his bag, and I quickly joined him. "Why do you need a respirator?" Connor asked as he watched the rest of our group put theirs on. "You never know what sort of mold or spores are going to be down here," Dr. Johnson explained. "You brought a mask with you, right?" "Sorry, Doc, I think I forgot to pack one," Connor said sheepishly. Dr. Johnson let out a sigh of deep disapproval. "How can you be going for a doctorate but can't follow simple instructions in an email?" Connor shrugged and began to walk into the cave. With this, the expedition had begun. The further we went into the cavern, the higher the density of roots became, turning what had once been a spacious open area into a narrow passage that forced our group to walk in a single file line. It felt as though we were walking through the nervous system of a body rather than a naturally occurring cave. After a half of squeezing through the narrow path of tendrils, we finally came to a larger opening where we could take a break. As I entered the area, I saw Dr. Johnson giving Connor a water bottle as he was in the middle of a coughing fit. "Should have worn a respirator," Dan said as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a box of American Spirit cigarettes. "Says the guy who's about to smoke in a fucking cave," Jean said. "Are you trying to give us all lung cancer?" "Seriously, Dan," Dr. Johnson said as she walked towards us. "I expected a National Geographic reporter to have a little more class than having an American Spirit in a cave. Look, I don't tell you how to live your life, so please don't tell me how to live mine," Dan said as he leaned against one of the thicker roots. As he took off his respirator and put the cigarette in his mouth, Dan pulled out a box of Strike Anywhere matches from his breast pocket and took one from the pack. "Do you guys think the root will mind?" Dan said sarcastically as he pulled out a match. "Wait, Dan, the roots are sensitive to heat. They're like a nerve receptor," I exclaimed as Dan struck the match onto the root. As he did this, the root quickly recoiled and slithered up the wall as if it had felt the heat of the fire. Surprised by the quick reaction speed of the root, Dan dropped the lit match onto a different root, which also recoiled at a tremendous speed. We watched in awe as the whole cavern began to shift and coil rapidly like a hungry pit of snakes that found a sliver of meat. This brief awe quickly turned to terror when we heard a loud rumbling from above us. "What the fuck was that?" Dan said as he quickly grabbed his grab. "I don't know, but we should probably keep moving," Connor said. "Oh fuck," Jean yelled. I quickly turned around and saw that the roof of the cave was beginning to crack. "The cave's gonna go," I yelled. Before we could even escape, the roof of the cavern exploded, causing the ground we were walking on to give way. We had walked only several hundred feet into the cave and were already being swallowed by it. I watched in horror as Jean, Dr. Johnson, and Connor plunged into the darkness below. Grabbing onto a root, I looked over at a petrified Dan. "Hold on, Dan," I yelled as my hands were being sliced by my skin slipping on the coarse roots. "I'm trying, Doc," Dan said as he tightened his grip around the root. "What the fuck? It grabbed me," Dan yelled. I turned to look at Dan, but before I could respond, my grip finally gave and I started to fall into the abyss below. I fell for a second before I was knocked unconscious by the drop. When I came to, I saw from the dim sunlight above that the area of the cave where we had taken our break was now 20 feet above me. Looking around, I couldn't see anything more than 10 in front of me, and I had no source of light that I could use. In a panic, I started calling out to the void. "Guys, are you okay? Where are you?" Suddenly I heard a weak voice to my right. "Dr. Bishop," Connor croaked out in between coughs. "Connor, where are you? Are you okay?" I asked frantically. "I'm over here," Connor muttered. "Just follow my voice." Not wanting to test my balance, I crawled on my hands and knees towards where I had heard Connor. Several feet in front of me, I accidentally grabbed what felt like a metallic cylinder. Feeling around the object further, I found the button and the room exploded with light. My brief excitement over being able to see was quickly crushed by the sight in front of me. Laying bloody and crumbled on the ground was Connor. Looking at his right leg, it looked as though it had taken the shape of the letter Z. Connor stared at me with a solemn look, as though he knew from my reaction that his situation wasn't good. "Guess I'm not the prettiest sight right now, huh?" Connor chuckled before having another coughing fit. "Take it easy, Connor, you're going to be fine," I said as I kneeled down beside him. "We just have to get out of here." "How are we going to do that?" Connor said. "There's no way I can climb that wall like this. Even if I could, I've been having these terrible coughing fits ever since I got here. Once I find where Dr. Wilson, Dr. Johnson, and Dan went, we will think of a plan. We have spare ropes in our bags, remember," I said as I slowly stood up. "Good luck, Dr. Bishop," Connor said as he gave me a small smile. "Please be safe." As I was standing, it became clear to me that I had suffered a concussion from the fall. Holding my head to help my searing headache, I slowly made my way down the corridor. As I did, I began to see more of the symbols from before. Pointing my flashlight at the opposite wall, I saw that there was an illustration of a group of people praying to what appeared to be a black scribble. As I stared at the drawing, I saw something slither by the peripheral of my vision, and I quickly shined my flashlight on the floor. Slinking away into the darkness was another black root. Using the wall as a crutch, I slowly followed the route further into the tunnel. Along the walls were even more pictures depicting the black scribble. One picture showed a white glow from the scribble as the people rejoiced over a good harvest. Another picture showed people gathered around the black scribble performing acts of ritualistic sacrifice. The last drawing I saw was the people running from the black scribble. Before I could look at any more drawing, I felt my left foot get stuck on a root before collapsing to the floor. As I went to stand up, I suddenly heard a sound further down the corridor. Guys, where are you? Are you okay? Hello, is anyone down there? I replied as I inched towards the voice. Are you okay, guys? Dan, Jean, Alicia, is that you? I called out to the darkness. Dan. After slowly making my way towards the voice for a couple minutes, I could finally see what looked like a shadow at the edge of my flashlight's range. I see you. Who's there? I called out again with a shaky voice. Dan. As I got closer, I could see Dan standing still in the middle of the corridor about 200 feet in front of me. As I moved closer, he started to wave at me. Thank God you're okay, Dan. I was worried. I quickly stopped in my tracks. Dan was still waving at me. Now that I was about 50 feet closer, I could tell that the way he was waving was almost as if his body was stuttering. He wasn't looking at me either. Instead, he was staring down at the floor. Before I could get any closer, I felt hands grab me by my mouth from behind and pull me into a small alcove. I tried to kick and scream, but whoever was dragging me was much stronger than I was. Once we had backed into the darkness, the person spoke. That isn't Dan, Jean whispered in a scared tone. As soon as I heard Jean's voice, my body eased up and I turned to face him. That's definitely Dan, I reassured Jean. He was standing right there. I know Kim, Jean whispered. He's been standing there waving for 2 hours now. I felt my whole body go numb when he said that. How could he have known that Dan had been waving at me? What the fuck is this place? I muttered. I have no clue, but we need to get the fuck out of here, Jean said as he put on his backpack. Where's Alicia? I asked in a hushed tone. We split off earlier. I think she was heading towards where we had fallen to try and find Connor, Jean replied. Connor is down this corridor, but he's in really rough shape, I said as I looked around for where my flashlight had fallen. Fuck, how bad is he hurt? Jean asked. Bad, he won't be able to walk on his own, I replied as I found my flashlight. As I went to grab it, I hit the button shining the light across the corridor. As soon as it turned on, Jean quickly reached over and turned it off. Fuck, he muttered as he backed to the edge of the alcove. Quick, Kim, get over here. Why? I asked as I slowly scooted towards Jean. Before Jean could answer, I heard the sound of scraping coming from down the hall. Jean, Alicia, Dan, where are you guys? The scrapping began to grow louder. Kim, as soon as that thing gets here, you need to be absolutely silent, Jean said in a serious hushed tone. What are we going to do? I whispered as I curled up next to Jean. I don't know, Jean said. We have to wait for it to get distracted so we can get the fuck out of here. Where are you guys? Guys, are you okay? The voice grew louder. Doc, where are you? As the voice came closer, I realized that whenever the voice spoke, it lacked a form of cadence. There was no rhythm, tone, or inflection. Whatever was speaking to us did not comprehend the basics of human communication. Where are you? Are you okay? Suddenly, I could make out the silhouette of a figure standing right in front of the alcove. Looking at its legs, I could see that it was hoisted several inches off the ground by roots protruding from the back of its legs. Its arms and head dangled like a limp stuffed animal. The figure rose about a foot off the ground and began to lean forward at a 45-degree angle. Suddenly, it lurched towards the wall of the alcove where Jean and I were hiding. As it crept towards us, I heard the sound of a soft thud a couple feet in front. The sound of the thud caused the creature to stop dead in its tracks. I remembered that Dan had kept his matchbook in his breast pocket. If this silhouette was Dan and that is what made the noise, then using the match could be our only chance of escape. As the figure stood only a couple feet in front of us, I slowly crept towards where I had heard the sound. I was just out of reach of the object when my knee landed on a small pebble, causing me to let out a soft gasp. At that moment, the whole world went silent as I noticed that the body of the figure was now at a much steeper angle. I couldn't see it, but from the angle of the body, I could tell that it was dangling directly above me. Holding back tears, I held my breath as I reached down and grabbed what he fell off of the figure. As soon as I picked up the object, I knew from the texture and shape that it was the matchbook. Taking one more deep breath, I laid on my stomach and held the match in front of me. I only had one chance to do this, so I couldn't afford to fuck it. I took a breath and counted down in my head to calm any nerves. 3. I put the head of the match to the stone floor. 2. I gripped the match so that it wouldn't fall out of my bloody hands. 1. I said a quick prayer in my head as I struck the match. As soon as the match head scraped the stone floor, the head burst into flames. Without thinking, I quickly tossed the match onto the root holding up the body. With incredible speed, the body jolted out of the alcove and slithered quickly into the darkness from which it came. As soon as it was out of sight, Jean helped me up and we bolted back towards where I had left Connor. As we got closer to the light of the open cavity above, we started to hear talking. Jean put out his arm to stop me and we hid in darkness along the wall. "What should we do?" Jean said. "I'm sure that it's just Connor. We shouldn't jump to conclusions." I said. I began to walk toward, but as I did, Jean grabbed my arm. "Kim, that fucking thing mimics voices and uses bodies as puppets. I think not rushing into a potential trap is jumping to conclusions." Jean replied in an annoyed tone. "You're right. What should we do then?" I asked. "Let's walk up slowly and stay out of sight until we are absolutely sure who or what is over there," Jean said. "Follow my lead." As I got behind Jean, I saw him grab at his waistband for an object. He quickly pulled out an orange revolver and held it in front of him. "What the fuck is that? A toy gun?" I asked sarcastically. "Bitch, this is a flare gun. I got more class than that," Jean retorted. We both let out a light chuckle as we inched closer. "Hey, who was that?" Connor said nervously. "We don't want any trouble, okay? Just leave us the fuck alone." "Seriously, Connor," Alicia snapped. Jean stopped and looked at me. "Yup, that's for sure. Them," Jean said as he hid the flare gun. "Don't worry, it's just Kim and I," Jean said as we both stepped into the circle of light. "Oh, thank God," Alicia said as she hugged Jean. "We need to get out of here right now." "Tell me about it." "What do you have with you?" Alicia said as she pointed to Jean's backpack. As he pulled his items out of his bag, our hopeful outlook was quickly diminished. "We have one bottle of ibuprofen, a fine garden magazine, a hand flare, a notebook and pen, and a bottle of red wine," Alicia said in a defeated tone. "How the fuck is any of this useful?" "Well, for starters, that wine is aged, so show it some respect. But more importantly, I wasn't planning on being attacked by a fucking fungi," Jean snapped. As Jean and Alicia began arguing, I took some of the ibuprofen and sat next to Connor. As I got closer to him, I noticed just how bad Connor's situation had gotten in the last hour. His skin had taken on a yellowish hue, his mouth had a white outline of crust around it, and his eyes had become blood red. "I look like shit, don't I?" Connor said in a joking tone. "You definitely looked a bit better this morning," I replied as I sat next to him. "A bit better," Connor said with a laugh. "Ouch, Dr. Bishop." "Please, call me Kim," I said. I felt Connor's forehead, which had become hot to the touch. "Kim, I don't want to die like this," Connor said as he leaned back on some rocks. "I have so much I have to do, and even more that I have to make up for." "You're going to be okay," I said as I gently ran my hand through his hair. "Then look me in the eyes when you say it," Connor said sternly. "Please, Kim, if I am going to die, at least give me the respect to tell me." I sighed and looked back at Alicia and Jean, who had stopped arguing to listen to our conversations. As I looked back at Jean for answers, Alicia walked over and met Connor's stare. "Connor, we will do everything we can to save you. But yes, you are most likely going to die," Alicia said bluntly. "Fuck," If I do die, can you please tell my parents that I died for something meaningful? Connor asked as tears began to drip out of his eyes. Of course I will, Alicia said with a shaken voice. Thank you. Ah, fuck, it's happening, Connor yelled as his body started to convulse. Alicia quickly grabbed him and put his head in her lap. Quick, do we have anything I can put in his mouth to stop him from biting off his tongue? Yes, take my button up, Gene said as he ripped off his Hawaiian shirt. As soon as Alicia grabbed the button up and looked back down at Connor, she was met with black projectile vomit. Alicia stumbled back while trying desperately to get the vomit off of her mask. As soon as the vomit was cleaned, she ran back over to Connor, only to be stopped by Gene. As soon as Alicia saw what Gene was holding her back from, she froze and her skin went pale. I looked where Gene and Alicia were staring, and to my horror, Connor was now standing upright and covered in dark black bile. As he stood, his body continued to convulse violently. After about 10 seconds, the top of his head began to expand into a cone shape. Oh my god, I said as I took a step back. What the fuck is happening? Alicia screamed as she began to sob. Suddenly, Connor's head burst open and his scalp folded over his eyes, revealing 4 black tendril roots that were moving erratically within his skull, spewing blood all over the surrounding rocks. Jesus fucking Christ, someone do something, Alicia cried out. 2 massive roots then started to protrude from his torso, creating a gaping hole where Connor's rib cage had once been. Hundreds of small roots then shot out of his legs, mangling them beyond recognition. His body then dropped to the floor, and the roots in his skull and torso began to carry his body into the darkness of the tunnel. We all just stood in silent shock. Not only had Connor died in front of us, but whatever he became was beyond anything a human should have to bear witness to. What's worse is that what happened to Connor could happen to us if we are down here any longer than we already have been. However, the scariest thought is whether it is already too late for us, and that it is only a matter of time before we share a similar fate. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Gene finally broke the silence. We need to find a way out of here. What should we do then? We could try to climb up from here, I said as I stared up at the newly formed pile of loose rocks. It's too risky. If we put too much tension on the wall, we might cause another collapse, Gene said. At this point, I'd take being crushed by a cave-in than whatever the fuck just happened to Connor, I replied. What if we go deeper into the corridor? Alicia said quietly. Gene and I stopped arguing and looked over at Alicia. And what would that accomplish? Gene replied sternly as he folded his arms. We could either find another exit or find it, Alicia replied as she grabbed her flashlight off the ground. Find what? I said as I stepped towards Alicia. The heart, Alicia responded. Gene took a deep breath and then turned to me. If you want to go, I say let's do it. I think it's our best shot at this point, I said as I looked at Alicia lead the way. As she gave me a cheery nod, I noticed something about her respirator mask. It had been cracked from the fall. As we ventured back into the corridor, I stopped the group to show them the wall drawings. So this thing used to be worshipped, Gene said as he studied the wall art. Maybe they're the ones who built these hallways, I replied. I doubt it, Alicia said as she studied the drawing of the people fleeing. What makes you say that? Gene asked. In that first drawing where the people are praying, it looks like they had also found this place and were praying to this being for a good harvest, Alicia said as she began to walk further down the hallway. I wonder how old this place is then, I said as Gene and I attempted to catch up to Alicia. Who knows, it could be as old as the earth itself, Alicia replied as she kept walking. Hey, why are you walking so fast? Can you slow down a bit? I asked as Alicia began to go out of sight. Suddenly, Alicia stopped walking and just stood still. You guys need to see this, Alicia happily exclaimed. Gene shot me a look before we both caught up to her. What are you looking at? All I see is just more hallway, Gene said as he looked back at me nervously. You don't see the brilliant lights? Alicia asked sadly. Nope, just hallway, I said. Are you feeling alright? Alicia turned to look at me with wide eyes and a droopy smile. Kim, I have never felt better. We are so close, I can feel it, Alicia said as she began to speed walk again. As she made her way down the hallway, Gene and I let some distance before we started to follow. What the hell is wrong with her? Gene said. She's acting totally different. Her mask got cracked during her fall, I said solemnly. Oh fuck, do you think she has what Connor had? Jean asked nervously. I have no clue, I said as we began to pick up the pace, but seeing as she's been exposed to the same air for roughly the same amount of time, I'd say something else is happening here. Guys, quickly come look. I found it, Alicia called from deep within the corridor. After a couple minutes, we finally caught up to her and stood in awe. We could see a beam of light coming from an opening a couple 100 feet away. Alicia, you an exit. Thank fucking God, Jean said as he hugged her. We both sprinted towards the light as Alicia followed behind us, laughing to herself. As soon as we got to the doorway, Jean gave me a hug. We're gonna be saved. After he let go and waited for Alicia to catch up to us, the three of us walked through the doorway and into the light. Once the light faded and we were on the other side, we froze in terror. This wasn't the exit. It wasn't any place that should even exist. The room seemingly stretched for miles in either direction. Blue and white lights glowed beyond the distance that the human eye can see. In the middle of this glowing chamber was a pulsating mass of black roots, eyes and veins which looked as though it was the size of a large mountain. Tendrils made of rotting muscle, eyes, and roots which connected the mass to the chamber seemed to stretch indefinitely, were hundreds of feet thick, and was gushing out black liquid. After being frozen in place, the mass began to shake, and the massive eye in the center of its form began to open. As it did, tendrils carrying thousands of corpses similar to Dan's hovered about us and spoke in unison. As the corpses spoke, Jean and I looked on in horror as Alicia bowed before the mass. Alicia Johnson, you have brought forth your harvest. The corpses sang in unison. I hath brought forth the harvest which you seek, Alicia replied. You must spread my divine word. Connor has given you the seed for which you must plant. The corpses bellowed in perfect harmony. Fuck this bullshit, Jean said as he raised his flare gun towards the mass. Before Jean could pull the trigger, Alicia had gotten up and smashed him over the head with rock. Jean, no, I screamed as I rushed to his side. Go forth, Alicia, join the harvest, join the harvest, the corpses screeched. Why the fuck would you do that, Jean? I said as I held his head. I wanted to go out in style. Jean said he coughed up blood. What do you mean? We could have just escaped, I cried. Kim, we both know that we can't leave this place. Not after what we've seen or what may be carried in our bodies. If Alicia escapes, she's going to kill a lot of people. You have to stop her, Jean said as his voice became weaker. How? She's so far ahead already, I said as I clutched Jean's head. Jean turned his head towards the flare gun that rested a couple feet away. With style, Jean said as he smiled. Now go, leave me here, Jean said as he closed his eyes. I'll see you soon, Jean, I said as I picked up the flare gun. I'll be waiting, he replied. I looked back at Jean and the mass one more time before I ran out of the chamber and after Alicia. As I ran towards the opening, I could hear the deafening sounds of thousands of people singing, "Join the harvest," all around me. As I turned a corner to head down the final hallway to the opening, I was met with a sucker punch to the face, which shattered my mask and sent me to the floor. When I came to, I saw Alicia sprinting towards the loose rock wall. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of thousands of feet scraping against the floor. I quickly got my bearing and made it to the wall, just as Alicia climbed to the top. As I began to climb the rock wall, Alicia started to throw rocks down on me. You can't stop me, Kim, Alicia yelled as she threw a rock at my head. I am it and it is me, the growth, and I demand sustenance. Join the harvest, or become the flesh which we shall devour. You pretentious bitch, stop speaking to me in riddles, I yelled back. Alicia quickly ran towards the entrance to the cave. After a couple minutes, I was able to scale the rock wall and ran towards the rope. As I passed through the narrow wall of roots, they began to scratch and claw at me as if to try and slow me down. However, I bore the pain, as I was not going to let Jean, Dan, and Connor die in vain. Once I emerged from the cave, I noticed that I was bleeding profusely from all of the cuts. With all my remaining strength and adrenaline, I made my way over to the rope and saw that Alicia was about 30 feet above the ground. This one's for you, Jean, I said as I raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. I watched as the flare soared over Alicia's head by 30 feet. You missed, Alicia yelled as the flare went past her. Nope, I said as I smiled. I was right on target. I watched as the flare exploded as it hit the rope, causing the polypropylene material to begin to melt. As Alicia was about 10 feet from the point of impact, the rope gave out, sending her to the ground. As she hit the tough stone below, I made my way back into the cave and found my bag. As I dumped out its contents onto the floor, I picked up an extra bottle of wine that Jean and I were going to share, took off my broken respirator, and began to type out this story. As I finish writing this, I can feel the influence of the spores overtaking my mind. It is too late for me, but if you are reading this, you must join the harvest and destroy the nest for good.